Sunday special, our life and legacy of President Andrew Jackson. A topic I already began last week, but I'm continuing. This is part two. If you want to learn about Jackson's early life and impact and how he became a national celebrity and how he eventually got elected president of the United States and became number seven, please go and watch the live stream lecture from last Sunday. We do these live stream lectures every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern. We have Q&As every Friday and Saturday at 6 p.m. Eastern, and short and long form content that drops throughout the every day, basically. So please go check that out. Like and subscribe. Become a friendly neighborhood historian. It's as easy as all of that. And I hope you all enjoy the live stream lecture. And I will not be interacting with the chat as much as I normally do. We may have time for Q&A at the end. We will see. But we're now talking about Andrew Jackson's presidency, so I hope you really enjoyed that. And again, if you do, like and subscribe. So Andrew Jackson, just to summarize, was orphaned at a very young age. He kind of creates this motif, this ethos of roughing and toughing it in the frontier, in the wilderness, in the Western territories, which back then were places like Tennessee and Kentucky. And then gains an appeal with the common man because he is a very common person. He's very base, he's brutish, he's thuggish, he gets into duels and fights all the time. He protects his woman's honor, Rachel Donaldson, his wife, who dies right before he becomes president. He's a military expert. He fights in the American Revolution, becomes a hero because of the Battle of New Orleans and the War of 1812. And basically he conquers Florida. He's well known for his fights against the Native Americans and uses this platform as a man of the people and a military savant to rise into political ranks. He serves in various different positions, and then his national celebrity is enough to boost him into the 1824 political election as the real first outsider to ever run for president. He loses in what he believes is a corrupt bargain between Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, who becomes president. He does everything in his power to influence the politics of Washington in his favor to basically ruin John Quincy Adams' presidency, and he's actually quite successful with the American system that Clay and Adams wanted to create, not really going anywhere. And then in 1828 runs against Adams in an extremely dirty race between the two of them, and eventually Jackson prevails and is elected the seventh president in 1828. Right before he becomes president, he is struck with personal tragedy as his wife dies. Yes, and thank you for joining us on Super Bowl Sunday. We will get this done quickly so you guys can all go and enjoy the Super Bowl. We may not even go a full hour today. We will see. We're probably not going to have the Q&A anyways, but before you go to your Super Bowl parties, think about some knowledge and information about Andrew Jackson you can use to impress your friends with as you're watching the big game. Go Seahawks. I'm not a Seahawks fan, but I don't want the Patriots to win. So, yes, we are talking about history and social studies as we do here all the time. If you enjoy it, please like and subscribe. But anyways, Andrew Jackson goes into the White House in 1829 to a lot of fanfare. He is one of the most popular. He has a popular status as a celebrity. And if you just rate presidents with their appeal with the common man and their overall popularity, Jackson is one of the most popular presidents in U.S. history. He will win both the 1828 election and the 1832 election in overwhelming fashion, 1832 being an even bigger blowout than his win over Adams in 1828. In 1832, he's faced up against a familiar opponent, Henry Clay, and there's an entire story to that that's actually quite interesting that I'll get into in a minute. But Jackson's presidency starts off with a bang, not a whimper, and his entire presidency is going to be a series of bangs rather than whimpers. A huge crowd follows him to the White House, and most of them are already publicly intoxicated. And basically, the White House becomes a frat house for most of the day with a huge party going on there, and Jackson basically letting the common man do what the common man does best. Swear, drink, gamble, all of that stuff. Jackson, despite his religious affiliations, despite his extreme amount of patriotism and his hardline beliefs in unionism, again, appeals to the common man and is the president who is extraordinarily accessible to the common man. It was very common in those days for people to be able to just walk into the White House and meet the president. There were office hours, basically, where the president was willing to meet people, and Washington, D.C. had not become the behemoth of a city that it is today. It was basically just a simple... It was basically just a simple walk up, and if you went in at the particular time and the right place, you could meet the president and you could meet other members of the government. And Washington, D.C. was a very small town at this time. So Andrew Jackson has quite an interesting... let me see here. Why can't we just delete this nonsense? Please stop trying to take over the chat, you weird trolls. Get out of here, please, while I talk about Andrew Jackson. So Jackson comes into the White House with a popularity. He swoops in with this inaugural address in which he promises to be the president of the common man. His White House party, the crowd, they all greet and revel with him in a lot of fanfare. And Jackson will administer as president during his 8 years as the president, seeking the best of the common man, populism, the popular values. Jackson seems to be the advocate of the individual man. Of course, the common man refers to the common white man. It does not refer to slaves. Jackson owns slaves. He does not fight at all to end slavery, and during his presidency, several states like Arkansas are added that have slavery in it. Jackson is a huge believer in westward expansion and the pioneer. He believes that the American pioneer will make America powerful and prosperous, and as they continue to extend west, he believes that there should be no moral consideration for the Native Americans, that this land belongs to the Americans themselves. They have won this land, and the Native Americans have no right to it whatsoever. And if they are not going to cultivate the land property, then it is up to common white Americans to do it. Good, God-fearing Americans are the ones who will save the day, and the Native Americans can go shove it. He also doesn't have any problem with the United States moving westward into former Spanish, now Mexican territory, as the Texas Revolution, which is supported by the United States, at least implicitly, occurs under his watch. So westward expansion, manifest destiny, common pioneers, roughing it in the wilderness, continuing to blaze trails for future Americans to go their way, does happen quite a bit during Jackson's presidency, and even after his presidency, people are inspired by Jacksonian democracy, which puts the individual at the peak of the American political experience, believing that it is the job of the individual to carve a path. If you really believe in American rugged individualism, picking yourself up by the bootstraps, all of those notions that are commonly associated with American vim and vigor, then it really is a Jacksonian principle that becomes a blueprint for democracy, for American democracy during the 19th century, and will continue to inspire presidents. He's the only president with an age named after him, the Age of Jackson, where a lot of these ideals are at least extraordinarily popular, and a lot of people are living by principles that he laid out and he individually personified. He's the first president from the West. He's not part of the old establishment guard, which was from the American Eastern Seaboard, either in the Virginia dynasty or, of course, in Massachusetts. So there's a lot about Andrew Jackson that really changes American politics. American politics is formidably different by the time he leaves the political scene from before he enters it. And in many ways, Jackson is the first populist to become the president of the United States, and he governs as a populist. So encouraging westward expansion, encouraging pioneers, continually advocating for the taking of land from Native Americans will be a huge tenet of Jackson. And perhaps that is where we should talk about perhaps Andrew Jackson's most controversial decision and moment in the White House, and that is about and by the way, I'm not talking about Jackson's first half of his life, so if you want to learn more about that, go and watch the video from last week. I'm talking about Andrew Jackson in his presidency today. He's a larger-than-life figure. He's an extremely controversial president. He's got a lot of moral failings and repercussions and problems. Jackson has a very complex legacy, so obviously he deserves a two-parter for the live stream lecture. So this is the part about his presidency. If you want to learn about his early life, go and watch the video from the live stream lecture from last week, as we do these every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern. So Jackson's presidency, again, starts off with a bang. He encourages westward expansion. He sells off federal land to private hands, and this is how he actually pays off the American debt. The United States is debt-free, not in a surplus, not in a surplus budget, but debt-free during Andrew Jackson's presidency. He is the only U.S. president to ever be able to achieve debt freedom, which he would be absolutely stunned and horrified by the debt of the United States today. So, yeah, Jackson was a heavy drinker. There's a lot of problems with Andrew Jackson, to be sure. And he had indeed been an Indian fighter and slayer who basically believed that the Indians had no right to their land, so taking that land is not a problem. And evicting the Native Americans from land they already held in the United States and ancestrally had held for centuries isn't a big problem for Andrew Jackson when he passes the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And the Indian Removal Act basically says that the Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Cherokee should all be removed from their lands in the American Southeast and be forced to move to new territories, such as the Indian Territory, which had been purchased during the Louisiana Purchase. This is modern-day Oklahoma, by the way. The Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole kind of go along with it. This is a huge mass exodus of Native Americans who are basically stripped of their ancestral homeland and forced to move westward. But one tribe in particular decides to fight back, the Cherokee in Georgia, and they decide to take their case to the federal courts, believing that they have an ancestral claim to that land, and the United States government just can't kick them out of it. They are living in the United States, but they can't just be stripped of their land on very faulty claims of eminent domain. So Jackson's this goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, despite the fact that early American history had been very pro-democratic, the Democratic Republicans had dominated the White House up until Jackson. The Democratic Party will dominate political elections for the next 30 years or so. The overwhelming majority of people in Congress are supporters of Jackson, despite the fact that the legislative and executive branches have been dominated by this individualistic mindset of America that had basically toss natives to the side. The courts have been dominated, thanks to the work of John Adams at the end of his presidency, by federalists who believed in a strong federal government, who did not believe in that you can just take land from people because it fits your agenda and it fits the pioneer spirit that you are representing. Federalists and later National Republicans and Whigs represent big business interests, mercantile interests. They usually are from the Northeast and New England, and John Adams had been the only Federalist president, and he had appointed John Marshall as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now, Marshall, in addition to being the most famous Supreme Court justice probably ever, if you really want to learn more, go and watch my long-form series on the Supreme Court and its history stretching back from the creation of the Republic all the way to the modern Supreme Court, where I analyze not just what the court is, but how it works and how it has changed and evolved over time historically and become more and more of a political juggernaut. But the court does make huge political decisions in the 1800s, and this is one of them, where Marshall basically had already created the idea of judicial review, where laws passed by the government can be basically overturned if a court feels that they are unconstitutional. Marshall, in a famous decision, says that the Cherokee tribe does not have to move, and the Indian Removal Act is unconstitutional. Jackson basically says that Marshall has no political power to do this. So the idea of a president ignoring the Supreme Court, ignoring the ruling of federal courts, is not something new. Andrew Jackson, first off, he sets the veto record, so he's more than willing to ignore Congress whenever he wants. The veto record back then was only 12. But he also decides to basically ignore what the Supreme Court says, saying famously that Justice Marshall has made his ruling, now let him enforce it. Jackson continues to unfold the Indian Removal Act, and his successor, Martin Van Buren, who is his vice president in his second term and basically the creator of Jacksonian democracy and the Democratic Party, will completely fulfill the Cherokee removal, which will, of course, lead to the Trail of Tears, where about 1/4 of the Cherokee population will die going from Georgia to Oklahoma and basically later be stripped of their land anyways, as their heritage continues to be eroded, their land is conquered, and their lives are deprived, and of course they're exposed to all sorts of death and disease that ruins them along the way. So Jackson's legacy when it comes to treating people equally and believing that all men are created equal is quite shoddy if you consider the Native Americans to be equal humans and not merciless savages like Jackson and many of his cohorts believed. Jackson's continual despising of the Native Americans stretches back to his early days in North Carolina. There's a lot about the psychology of Andrew Jackson that is formed by his early life, when Native Americans, oftentimes working with the British in the American Revolution, raided and attacked local areas where Jackson lives. So Jackson has no tolerance or patience or mercy towards the Native Americans, who he believes are equally merciless and don't deserve any land whatsoever. And if it's between a common white American having the land and a Native American, Jackson will pick the American every single time. So this unilateral decision, which overwhelms and overrides the Supreme Court's decision to side with the natives, puts Jackson on blast by his opponents, who basically criticize him for being this guy who says that he's an advocate for the common man, but actually is using governmental power to basically live like a dictator, a tyrant, and a king. He basically uses the power of the federal government whenever he wants to do whatever he wants and accomplish his own aims, and he doesn't care about the system that the founders created, and he is jeopardizing its very sanctity and safety only 50 years after the Constitution is written, less than 50 years after the Constitution is written. This leads to his opponents to claim that he is King Andrew, and this derisive term will continue to haunt Jackson throughout his presidency, but with overwhelming support in the legislative branch, and with Jackson also basically doing whatever he wants in the executive branch, and his overwhelming popularity with the American people, Jackson is able to basically get rubber stamps on much of his agenda throughout his presidency, and is able to basically have third-term advocate in Martin Van Buren, who will carry out some of his more controversial decisions, which will be some of his more damaging ones. First off is the Native Americans, and there's another one later that will devastate the American economy that I will discuss. However, let's turn to the personal side of things. Jackson despises the executive branch, and he despises the way the departments in his government are laid out. And this is going to lead to a lot of issues. He will go through several different secretaries in different departments in state, war, treasury. However, there is a women's scandal that threatens the sanctity and harmony of his cabinet early on when he finds out that the wife of his Secretary of War, I believe it was his Secretary of War, was also married her husband before receiving a divorce from her first husband, which Jackson had had with his wife, Rachel, before she had not fully cleared her divorce before marrying Andrew. Now, it's a lot harder to keep, the records are a lot shoddier, harder to gain access to, communication is a lot shorter because this is even before we have the telegraph and telegram. So the women, the wives of Jackson's cabinet members, are shunning this woman, I forget her name, and Jackson is absolutely incensed by this, feeling a personal connection to this story. He projects his own suffering and depression onto it and basically starts firing people and having beef with a bunch of his different cabinet members because they spurned this woman. Some of his cabinet members include Martin Van Buren, but also Roger Taney is his Secretary of Treasury for a short time. That man will go on to be the Supreme Court Justice who rules in Dred Scott versus in the Dred Scott decision. I forget, it was Scott versus who? I'm trying to remember. But basically, Jackson's cabinet is made up of Southerners sympathetic to Jacksonian democracy, believing in concepts like popular sovereignty, the will of the people, and majority rule. Basically, it doesn't matter if it's moral, if a majority of people agree with it, is probably the right thing to do. Popular sovereignty basically says that states, municipalities, local areas should be able to decide what they want, whether they want this measure or that measure. So there's a lot of true democracy in Jacksonian politics in his cabinet and amongst his supporters in the West and in the southern part of the United States. And this becomes known, and that's why his party is known as the Democratic Party, basically believing in the will of the people to achieve the better aim of the government and the society. And Jackson appeals to the will of the people throughout his presidency, basically believing that what he is doing is for the best of all Americans, and that is why we can easily call Andrew Jackson a populist, and indeed the first populist president, and he will not be the last one. I am not answering anything in the chat right now, but I hope you're really enjoying this live stream lecture, and if you are, please like and subscribe. So Jackson dismisses cabinet members ad nauseum and basically becomes sick and tired of the whole system of the departments and how they work against him. He oftentimes will hold cabinet meetings and will lose his temper, yelling and screaming at them until they basically walk out in horror, and then turning to Van Buren, who is really the only person who Jackson allows on the inside, a man who cannot be more different than Jackson himself, and say, "They thought I was crazy." Jackson is a huge actor. He is very good at embellishing, exaggerating, acting audaciously to basically get whatever he wants and achieve whatever he needs. This is a huge component of Jackson's behavior. This audacity has allowed him to succeed greatly in life, and his penchant for exaggeration, lying, manipulation, and emotional sensationalism, as well as demagoguery, are all part of his political rise to power. Jackson has pretended like he is a common man, and in many ways he is, but he is also an extremely wealthy plantation owner, owning what's called the Hermitage in Tennessee, a slave owner, and a longtime political operative who has had a political career that has stretched over 30 years. But he leans more to gain support and appeal throughout his presidential elections and his time as president. He leans heavily into the idea of being born in a log cabin, being a warrior who fights against Indians, and being a veteran of the American Revolution, the last president to serve in the American Revolution. So Jackson knows what to lean into in order to gain popular political support, but he also has a more complex personality than this, where he is somebody who has definitely tasted the finer things in life and has done well for himself. But he uses that motif, rather than to say that he's a hypocrite, to say that he has achieved the American dream by pulling himself up by the bootstraps. Now, he probably didn't quite use language like this, but this is definitely the attitude of the people of the of Jacksonian democracy, of the early Democratic Party, of the 1830s and 40s. It's the pioneer mindset that Jackson will take and put on the highest of pedestals, basically playing it on blast while in the White House as the most powerful person in the country. And thank you, Frog, so much for the super chat. Really appreciate it. All the money you give to this channel goes into making it a better place for all of you. So hopefully you all are enjoying the content today. So what happens next? Jackson has his personal scandals, you have political scandals, you have his opponents basically believing he's a king, but none of this stops Jackson. He is quite indefatigable throughout much of his administration and basically getting whatever he wants and achieving whatever he wants, and he does quite well at achieving it. Again, America expands and grows more prosperous. The American system that Jackson had originally hated actually becomes his motif of building large infrastructural projects, roads, highways, bridges, and canals in order to help American expansion, in order to connect America more, in order to grow America's infrastructural integrity and connect America across greater lines. This is also the time that the railroads and the steamships are coming about. The Industrial Revolution is starting to set in America throughout the 1820s and 1830s, and Jackson is definitely here for that. So, what happens next? Jackson faces his biggest political challenge perhaps in 1832, and this is probably where Jackson's economic legacy as the president who paid off American debt runs right into one of his bigger issues, and that is the destruction of the Bank of the United States. Now, Andrew Jackson doesn't have any particular views on the Bank of the United States going into this controversy. However, his own personal vendettas will serve as a major conduit for what he will achieve. Jackson does see the Bank of the United States as a threat to individual rights, freedoms, and responsibility. He also sees it as government overreach, but he doesn't mind it at all. Before the bank issue happens, however, there is another economic issue that I probably should touch on that gives you a better idea of the conflicting nature of Andrew Jackson. This rugged individualist who believes that the federal government should not run the country and believes very much in the rights of individuals, of states' rights, of local rights, of a pioneer mindset, of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, will unilaterally ignore a state's desire to basically ignore federal law. I think it's in either 1831 or 1832, but South Carolina, there is a new tariff law that is passed, and South Carolina's assembly votes to nullify it. South Carolina basically believes this tariff will be bad for business, and they have no business following it. So they decide that they can nullify federal laws, that the states do not have to follow federal laws. This creates a constitutional challenge and a potential crisis, because if one state can nullify federal laws, then they can all nullify federal laws, and we're back to the Articles of Confederation, where a very weak centralized government cannot actually get anything done unless a state is willing to follow it. Despite the fact that Jackson is a Southerner who is sympathetic to the South Carolinians and is a slave owner and checks all of the boxes of being a rugged individualist, Jackson actually opposes their effort to nullify the law. In a show of complexity of his political character and identity, Jackson stands opposed to his own vice president, a holdover from John Quincy Adams, John C. Calhoun. Calhoun will resign at the end of the year to become a senator from South Carolina, and he is one of Jackson's biggest opponents. Much like Aaron Burr, vice presidents at this time were not extraordinarily loyal to the president they served under. Calhoun is the only vice president to serve under two different presidents and to serve under both of them in quick succession. So Calhoun, who had presidential aspirations of himself and sees himself as the advocate for states' rights and popular sovereignty, is very much a Jacksonian Democrat in many of his ways, and here he will actually apply those principles to his own situation. In a paradoxical move by Jackson, he will contradict his own ethos and basically say South Carolina has no right to nullify federal law because federal law oversees everything, because the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and therefore federal law is binding on states, and states can't just throw out laws whenever they want. This could have created a secession crisis 30 years before, but Jackson basically uses 30 years before the Civil War would create a secession crisis would create the Civil War, and South Carolina would be the first one to secede from the Union, unironically, 30 years after this happens. But Jackson basically says that he will raise an army, invade South Carolina, and hang John C. Calhoun. Mind you, John C. Calhoun is still his vice president, so Andrew Jackson actually literally threatened to hang his own vice president, because he was that psychotic about this, and he basically has connected his own ethos of the individual, of rugged democracy, of westward expansion and manifest destiny, with the idea. And by the way, John O'Sullivan's? I think Sullivan's work, where he uses the term manifest destiny, is written either during Jackson's presidency or right after it, and that becomes the motif of the era. But it's basically coining a phrase that was already existent, because Americans' westward expansion had been happening ever since America had become a country. The Louisiana Purchase had obviously been the biggest step towards this, and the Mexican-American War, carried out by Jackson's loyal follower and future president James K. Polk, would basically be a fulfillment of Jacksonian democracy, in which basically, darn whoever else is around, as long as we Americans get what we want, that's all that matters, which will, of course, net America, the Southwest California, and his own negotiations with the British will get the United States the Pacific Northwest. So Jackson marries this rugged individual motif with the idea of unionism. And unionism will be a popular political theory throughout the rest of the 19th century, and especially in the lead up to the Civil War over the debate of slavery. Basically, the argument is that our federal union, as Jackson says, must be preserved. Whatever happens, whatever laws are passed, the federal union must be preserved. States cannot nullify laws, and they cannot leave a country over these new laws. That is a cheat code. That is a violation. That is a illicit chess move, basically, in American politics. If they don't like the law, they can work to try to overturn it in the courts, or elect representatives who will fight against the law or try to make a new law to overturn it, but they can't just leave the country. And they can't just ignore laws that are passed by the federal government. Our federal union must be preserved. So Jackson is, on the one end, a hyper-individualist and populist, but he is also a unionist who believes that at some point, some way, the federal government has to have the right to be able to rule over the country and have greater power and greater ability to determine and enforce laws than states and local municipalities. So Jackson's individualism, his rugged beliefs in states' rights, does have limits. And so this is the basic motif of the Democratic Party, at least some of the Democratic Party, for the next 30 years. Well, some Democrats will basically side with Calhoun, becoming Southern Democrats, believing that nullifying federal laws is perfectly okay. Northern Democrats, in the future, people like Franklin Pierce and Stephen Douglas, will deny the efficacy of nullifying federal laws or seceding over federal law. Remember, South Carolina will secede just because Abraham Lincoln gets elected president. Lincoln himself is a unionist. Lincoln, in many ways, appeals to the Jacksonian model, and you could say that Lincoln and his successor, Andrew Johnson, are the last two Jacksonian presidents, as the Jacksonian ideals of unionism and individualism will continue to impact the White House and government until after the Civil War, when a new model has to be created, where the Republican Party will become the dominant political party for the rest of the 19th century. But Jackson's political legacy will echo throughout the Civil War and even leading up to it. And Lincoln himself will say famously, if I could keep the Union together and not free a single slave, I would do it. So Lincoln will champion unionism. There's a Union Party that runs a man named John Bell in 1860 amongst the division between the Democrats and the Republicans. So the idea of preserving the federal union is a Jacksonian ideal that will heavily influence part of the Democratic Party and the other political parties throughout the rest of the 19th century. Future people who run for president, like Zachary Taylor and William Henry Harrison, the only two men elected to be president from the Whig Party, which is supposed to be against Jackson, will tout themselves as military heroes who believe in individual rights, kind of going off of the same motif and model of Andrew Jackson. But I'm probably getting too much into his legacy at that point. So eventually South Carolina backs down at the threat of being invaded and not being able to secede or nullify laws if they're all dead. John C. Calhoun leaves Washington, D.C., at least in the executive branch, in disgrace, and becomes a senator who will immediately fight against Jackson for the rest of his time as president. But in 1832, Jackson receives another challenge, this time from an old enemy, Henry Clay. Now, if you were here last week, you know that Henry Clay made an agreement of some sort, probably, with John Quincy Adams, where Adams would pick Clay to be Secretary of State, a stepping stone to the White House, and Clay would use his influence in the House of Representatives to help get Adams elected over Jackson in 1824. Because of this, Andrew Jackson has nothing but resentment for Clay. Clay is still an extremely influential politician and has presidential aspirations of his own, which he will basically do in 1832, running for president again on a group, forming a political party that is basically opposed to whatever Jackson is. Whatever Jackson says, they are opposed to it. So they will be a conglomerate of different people with different ideas, both from the North and the South, with various different values and morality, various different opinions on the rising issue of slavery, as well as westward expansion. But they are basically united in one thing: hating everything that's Jacksonian democracy. If you don't want Jacksonian democracy, you could be a Whig. And that is the name of the party, based off, of course, of a British party, the Whigs, which will transform into the Liberal Party. But but Clay basically decides to boost his presidential aspirations by becoming the opposite of Jackson. He believes that supporting the National Bank is a good thing. The National Bank, of course, created by Alexander Hamilton, has a charter that needs to be renewed by federal law every few years at this point. So Clay basically decides that he will influence Jackson to pass a new charter for the Bank of the United States. Clay will get the glory as the person who saved the Bank of the United States. Jackson will get none of the glory, and by presenting it to him on the 4th of July, it will be a very patriotic American thing where Clay will be able to boost his own standing as the man who forced Andrew Jackson's hand. And Clay is close allies with the president of the Bank of the United States, a man named Nicholas Biddle. Now, Jackson doesn't really care about the Bank of the United States. He eventually will use it as this idea of him taking down the Bank of the United States is a swing for the little man against the big business interests that are trying to hold down the common man. This is, again, a tenet of Jacksonian democracy, but it's an ex post facto application that basically revises the story where Jackson went from pretty agnostic about the bank to being absolutely hateful of it. And the only reason that actually works is because Jackson will reinterpret the information and use his audacity and manipulation and his popularity with the common man to basically do what he can to turn Biddle and Clay into the enemies of the common man for advocating for the renewal of the charter of the Bank of the United States. The bank isn't an enemy to Jackson, but once he realizes Henry Clay is involved, it becomes an enemy to Andrew Jackson. And because it's an enemy to Andrew Jackson, Jackson uses his influence to make it into an enemy of the common man, which it hadn't necessarily been before, even in Jackson's eyes. So if you see the subtle signs of political manipulation and the mind of a man who's far more complex than just a brash soldier, then you've got it. Jackson wants people to believe that he's a brash soldier who's just fighting for the individuals because he loves this country, but he's actually far more calculating, far more vengeful, and far more vindictive than any of that. Now, is this necessarily a bad thing? It can be, but it's not necessarily a fully bad thing. Anyways, okay. If Harry's here, can he start monitoring the chat? Because I can't see all of this, and I'm reading a few of the comments, and they're just ridiculously insensitive and stupid. What was I going to say next? So Jackson vetoes the legislation, surprising a lot of people, and then goes on to win the election. After he wins the election, he basically takes it out on Biddle. Defeating Clay in a landslide is his victory against Clay, and then his next issue is basically trying to destroy and dismantle the Bank of the United States, which will become the main goal of his second term. He will spend most of the rest of his presidency doing what he can to defame Biddle, destroy Biddle's political career, and ruin the Bank of the United States. He's even censured, the only president to be censured by Congress because of his actions, but basically the Democrats regained control of the House of Representatives in the 1834 elections and allowed Jackson to act like it never happened by expunging the idea that he was ever censured. So Jackson is extraordinarily politically savvy, he's extraordinarily vindictive, and he is also able to code it in the terms of Jacksonian democracy. So his strike against the Bank of the United States in many ways is a double victory for him. It's a win-win. He continues to solidify and consolidate the idea that he is the fighter for the common man, and he is able to disparage and destroy and hurt Henry Clay. Jackson despite his ambitions, despite his dictatorial nature, his tyranny, his willingness to ignore the Supreme Court, to destroy political enemies for the sake of politics and then claim it's for the right political motivations, despite the Indian Removal Act, despite all of the things that Jackson has done that are extraordinarily personal, vindictive, and controversial, and despite the fact that Jackson uses federal authority unilaterally, ignoring courts whenever he wishes, and basically getting whatever he wants or going crazy and ballistic if he doesn't choose to run for a third term in 1836. He follows the model of George Washington, whom he has respect for, of only staying for 2 terms. If he had wanted a third term, he certainly would have gotten it. And then the King Andrew thing probably would have become far more real. For it'll take another century for another extremely popular Democratic president to go for more than 2 terms. Jackson does not run in 1836, but he does do, for the first time in American presidential history, the thing where a president picks his successor. Martin Van Buren is a wealthy New Yorker from a rich Dutch lineage. He did not fight in any wars. He's known for being extraordinarily fashionable and stylish, having exquisite, ostentatious, and garish tastes, and riding around in carriages, and he has nothing to do with Jacksonian democracy except for the fact that he is the political brains that created the Democratic Party and basically sold the United States on Jackson being a man of the people, which it's not hard to do because Jackson was a man of the people, but he was so much more than that. And basically, Jackson leaves office with all-time popularity. He has a Democratic president to replace him who will continue to rubber stamp his agenda. Van Buren does not have the political charisma of Andrew Jackson, so it's obvious that he won't be what Jackson was, but hopefully everything will remain steady. However, problems ensue. Van Buren enforcing the Trail of Tears leads to the death of, once again, 1 in 4 Cherokees who are forced out of their ancestral homelands and forced to go to Oklahoma. The destruction of the Bank of the United States does not destabilizes the money supply and currency. It does not allow for austerity, the measures for the federal government to take austerity measures to prevent the panic of 1837 and 1839 from basically devastating and destroying the American economy, especially when there's a glut on the cotton market. So basically, the economic situation becomes an absolute disaster. There is no Bank of the United States to basically stabilize the various different state economies, and the panic of 1837 and 1839 could have been avoided had Jackson not dismantled the Bank of the United States and Van Buren carried it out. Basically, Van Buren, everything wrong with Jackson's presidency doesn't affect Jackson's presidency, and it really doesn't affect his legacy that much because he's a larger-than-life figure. People don't blame Jackson and oftentimes feel that if Jackson had been in the White House, this never would have happened, even though Jackson's actions at dismantling the Bank of the United States is probably what caused the panic of 1837 and 1839. So, Jackson is out of office. He doesn't get blame. In fact, many people believe he should come back and run for a third term, and I'll get to that in a second. Van Buren is booted out of office in 1840 by a general who styles himself very much a Jacksonian, although he is a Whig, named William Henry Harrison. Jackson remains the dominant force in the political party, despite the fact that he is still living in the Hermitage and is in advanced age. He continues to be the sounding board for what the Democrats are going to do going forward. Before I mention all of that, Jackson is the first U.S. president to have an assassin target him. In 1835, a man goes up to Jackson, takes out a gun, and shoots at him, and but the gun misfires. The 68-year-old then proceeds to take out his cane and start beating the pulp out of the guy while police are called and the guy is arrested. So Jackson, despite the fact that he leaves office pretty advanced in age, Jackson is the oldest president to date at this time, in his late 60s already by the time he leaves office in 1837. He turned 70 that year, as a matter of fact. Despite all of that, Jackson is courted by the Democrats to return in 1844. Van Buren went nowhere. John Tyler, who becomes president after Harrison dies in office, is extraordinarily ineffectual and basically a Democrat in disguise. The Whigs abandon him. The Democrats do not trust him. So who's going to be the president in 1844? Who's going to carry out the expansionist, manifest destiny, Jacksonian model, the semi-religious glorification of the individual, of the Westerner, of the pioneer, of the farmer, of all of these things that Jackson and before him, to some extent, Thomas Jefferson had pushed? Who's going to carry that out? Well, Jackson plays kingmaker again, and he's extraordinarily old. He's 77 or 78 in 1845, so he actually chooses not to run for another term. But he chooses a political pupil of his, 25 years his junior, named James Polk from Tennessee, who basically will carry out all of Jackson's whims and wishes. If you're making a comparison between Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump, you could see Jackson being a Donald Trump-esque like figure and Polk being his J.D. Vance, somebody who takes his political ideology and breathes into it his own style and is even more convinced of it in some ways than the predecessor and primogenitor of it and the creator of it. So Jackson handpicks Polk, and Polk is an unknown president. He's the first dark horse to emerge into the presidency in U.S. history, and Polk actually successfully triumphs. He defeats Henry Clay, of all people, again, around still, and becomes president. Jackson dies in 1845, while Polk, who has promised to serve only one term, begins fulfilling the Manifest Destiny and the Sea to Shining Sea concept in one of the most successful presidencies you've never heard of, which definitely deserves its own live stream lecture, which I will discuss at another time. Jackson dies in 1845 at the age of 78, living with his daughter in the Hermitage and her family, and I believe he allows his slaves to go free after his death. But there you have it. That is the life and legacy of Andrew Jackson, well, at least the life part of it, the 7th president of the United States. Obviously changed the country. There are presidents, like I've said before, who are great before, during, and after their presidency. Washington and Lincoln are great examples of this. There are presidents who were not great during their presidency, but in retrospect actually turned out to be pretty on the ball and pretty good. History looks back on them pretty fondly. Dwight Eisenhower is a great example of this. There are presidents who are seen as good during their presidency, but now are seen as bad. Thomas Jefferson has a little bit of this, unfortunately, on him. I don't think that's fair. Lyndon Johnson was seen as very successful during his presidency, now has more of a mixed reputation. Reagan has definitely suffered some of that because of the economic consequences of his policies. And then there are presidents who are seen as bad, but actually during their presidency who actually turn out to be good. Chester Arthur is an example of this. But on top of all of this, there's actually a fifth category. And the fifth category is a president who is seen as bad now, but was good for the moment, and actually makes sense to say that they're a good president. And I think Andrew Jackson belongs in this category. He was a good president for the time. It made total sense, almost everything he did, in the context in which he lived. He was very much a victim of his time. He is probably on the brasher, nastier side of the victim of his time argument, where you can say, yeah, that was pretty bad even by those standards in those days. Some victims of their time, pretty sensible. Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, perhaps. Some victims of their time don't get that excuse, like Woodrow Wilson, if we're talking about U.S. presidents. But if we're talking about Andrew Jackson, Jackson does stretch the victim of his time narrative, but he also does do a lot to make America powerful, successful, and glorious. And America does grow and change and get better, get stronger, get more complete, more robust. Everything that it will need to become for the rest of the 19th century is kind of set up during this period. Westward expansion is a huge benefit to the United States over the long period of time. Now, if you want to look at it from a social standpoint and from history from below, obviously that means horrible things for the Mexicans and the Native Americans and the slaves that are brought into the Western territories. Completely understandable, reasonable objection. From a moral standpoint, Andrew Jackson is not a good man. But in many ways, getting done what America needed to get done, improving America, providing for it a new age, a new motif, an ethos that will make it more powerful, richer, and more successful, makes a lot of sense when you understand Andrew Jackson. So in many ways, Jackson is not a good person morally. His presidency seems really bad in retrospect. There's a lot of people who wonder why he's on the $20 bill, but when you look and examine his presidency in the context of his time period, if you look at not the before or after, but at the during part of it, Jackson is actually a pretty good president. Now, where do I rank Andrew Jackson? Some people think he's a top 10 president. I don't think so. I don't remember what I put him on my presidential tier list video. You can watch my entire series of U.S. presidents, by the way, here on YouTube, and watch my tier ranking video to see how I think of each president individually. But where do I'd say Jackson is a B tier president. I think he's definitely in the top 15. It's hard to think of 15 presidents who are better than him. It's hard to think of 10 presidents who are more impactful than him. If I was going off of presidential impact, Jackson might even be in the top 5. He creates the Democratic Party. He basically creates the entire political debate of the 19th century, and he basically creates the idea of manifest destiny before it's even called manifest destiny. So Jackson changes America a lot, and I don't know that any of the changes in which he does, of how he changes America on a large scale, are actually necessarily things that are bad for the country or its people. Jacksonian democracy defines an entire generation that will settle the West. Westward expansion, the accumulation of resources, is good for the country on the net. Jackson's political motif will create the Democratic Party, which, for better or worse, still exists to this day and remains extraordinarily impactful as the most successful political party in U.S. history. So there's a lot to despise about Andrew Jackson's morality, and there's a lot to dislike about his presidency. There's a lot to raise about the constitutionality of many of his actions. But the impact of Andrew Jackson is almost undeniable. There's a reason he's on the $20 bill. Now, should he be replaced? That's another debate for another time. I kind of lean towards the yes, he should be replaced. But at the same time, we have to understand that presidents only get 4 or 8 years unless you're FDR and you basically are a dictator who served 12 years and would have served 16 had he not died in office. So presidents only get a short amount of time. And we judge presidents on what they do during and after their presidency, but Washington gets a huge boost because of what he did before his presidency. Jackson's conquest of Florida, his success in the War of 1812, his personality, his creation of the Democratic Party. All of this stuff is a huge contribution to the American cultural zeitgeist, to our historical identity and ethos as Americans. And while a lot of it is not pretty, like Andrew Jackson wouldn't care about that. In very Jacksonian fashion, who cares if it's pretty? What is the impact? What is the change? Are things better because I was there? And I think the truth of the matter is, for Americans in the 19th century, looking at just the during and the immediate aftermath of Jackson's presidency, you have to say that things are better in the United States in 1837 than they were in 1829. America is grown, it's more robust, it's stronger, it's richer, it's expanding, and things are getting better in America, you could say. Now, that is a very limiting view because you're looking at an America that is overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly dominated by men. So it's not necessarily a woke interpretation of Andrew Jackson's presidency, but I think it's an accurate and fair one based off of the context of his time. And I think that's where we really should look at Jackson. If you're ever wondering why the heck is Andrew Jackson so impactful, it's because of what he did and how it impacted not just his presidency, but the 19th century itself. So in many ways, Andrew Jackson is the right man for the right time, even though he is the wrong man on so many other issues. So I'd say Jackson is probably one of the top 15 presidents in U.S. history. He is at least top 10 in terms of impact. And in moral character, he's probably in the bottom 10. Based off of how he acted and treated other people, and how he obviously acted on a macro scale relating to Native Americans and things of that nature. So it's a complex opinion. It's not an easy one to develop, but it's taken me a long time to figure out what I actually think of Andrew Jackson. I obviously grew up as an American with a very jingoistic view of Andrew Jackson, but as I grew older, obviously I came of age at a time when reevaluating historical figures and realizing their moral failings was all the rage, and that obviously impacted my opinion of Andrew Jackson. But now in the kind of the post-woke society that we live in today, we can't lionize figures from the past because we don't want to ignore their moral failings and because we've decided to double down on patriotism. It seems to me, from an American lens and from a historical lens, that we are actually better served by melding all of these different approaches to looking at a particular character and kind of synthesizing them into a more robust vision of who that person was. Understanding that context matters, but moral actions do matter at the same time. Yes, I have mentioned that, Charles. You'll have to go back and watch the video from last week. So I would say that really I've hated a lot of what Andrew Jackson has done. He seems like an awful person in many, many ways, but he also seems like an undeniable person. You can't ignore him. You can't pretend he doesn't exist. And in many ways, that's his presidential legacy. You may dislike a lot of what he has done, but you can't ignore the fact that he exists. Andrew Jackson might be the squeaky wheel that gets the grease when you think of U.S. presidents. And that's not necessarily saying that it's bad or good. It's just you can't ignore him. Love him or hate him, you can't forget about him. And that's probably the best way to sum up Andrew Jackson's presidency. An extremely controversial legacy, yet probably one of the most impactful presidents in all of U.S. history. Now, to be fair, there are presidents who are impactful in wrong ways. James Buchanan is very impactful in bad ways. Herbert Hoover is impactful in bad ways. Lincoln is impactful in good ways. Jackson is impactful, and the impact, at least at the time of his presidency and lifetime, seems to have been pretty positive. And in many ways, the United States wouldn't have become what it would become without Jackson. Now, every president contributes to that in some way, shape, or form, but Jackson holds a disproportionate effect in the 19th century. I think only Lincoln is more impactful in terms of America in the 1800s. Yes, over Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and other presidents. Only Lincoln is more impactful than Andrew Jackson in the terms of American politics and history in the 1800s. So, yeah. I think that's the way to sum it up. He was a very impactful person. He was a stretched victim of his time, but he was a despicable person. Yeah, but I think that in some ways, when we rate a president, how much of his character, Jackson brings up the issue of how much does character actually matter in terms of evaluating a presidency? How utilitarian do we want to be about thinking about the most powerful man in the country, and nowadays the most powerful man in the world? It's an interesting thing. And I think a lot of people who are struggling with the whole issue of Donald Trump being in the White House again and hating that that's happening, or people who absolutely love Trump, can look back to Andrew Jackson and see somebody who is kind of the model of Donald Trump before Donald Trump. The fighter before the fighter, the person who talks like the common person, the person who, I don't care that he's mean, I don't care that he's brash, he gets things done. People were saying that about Andrew Jackson in the 1820s and 30s. His opponents were comparing him to a king. Now, will Trump be as impactful as Andrew Jackson? I have no idea. The next 3 years will tell a lot. But it is kind of interesting that Andrew Jackson claimed an election was stolen from him, used that to create a political movement, and then returned to the White House in powerful fashion. There is, for people who tend to have the opinion that Donald Trump we've never seen anything like this and this is so awful, or we've never seen anything like this and isn't this great? No, I'm going to correct both of you. We have seen something like this. It's this guy. And Jackson is probably a much better president than Trump was in many, many ways, but because he lived in a much different time period where behavior like this was more of a norm than you would think, and in a fledgling country that needed to expand and needed to grow, needed someone like Jackson at the helm. So maybe those are things to think about. A country that has developed and is living in a post-World War II or World War III consensus, post-Cold War consensus, versus a country that's barely starting out. It's hard to compare them in that context. But in terms of personality, behavior, and the way they are discussed, they are the same. And maybe that kind of points to my entire view of history itself, is that human nature doesn't change, and history is all about human nature. So when we study human nature, we actually see things repeat. We see rhymes and patterns over and over again, with leaders as examples, with policy as example, and with people as the main example. The way we react to things and handle different things hasn't changed as much as we would like to think it has, even though we have iPhones and the internet. People said the same things about Andrew Jackson that people say about Donald Trump, and they are comparable in many, many ways. So, anyways, that's a quick summary. Well, not a quick summary. There's a lot more I could talk about, or should talk about, but Andrew Jackson is quite a fascinating and interesting character. Please like and subscribe. I hope you enjoyed the live stream lecture. I will stay on to answer questions about history or social sciences for another 10 minutes, as I know a lot of people are getting ready for the big game, and I hope you all really enjoy it. Go Seahawks. I'm not a Seahawks fan, but I hate the Patriots, so there you go. But I hope everybody has really enjoyed this and learned something about Andrew Jackson and will impress their friends with it at all their Super Bowl parties. Yeah, Jackson, pick a side. It's hard to really to reconcile Andrew Jackson. His brutish violence made its way into his presidency. His audacity, his manipulation, his politicking, it made its way in his presidency. His extreme effectiveness also made its way into his presidency. Jackson was a genocidal POS. Well, I mean, it's interesting because so many of the people of that time period, by that standard, were genocidal. Now, I don't believe that a genocide was committed against the Native Americans. I think Jackson is probably the closest you can get to actually saying genocide with what was done to the Cherokee. You could make parallels between what happened to the Cherokee and what happened to the Armenians by the Turks in 1914 to 1915. So it's complex. It's very complex. Do you think it's wrong to hate German World War II veterans? Well, I think it's World War III. I think there's been 3 world wars. I don't think you should. I mean, there's obviously a spectrum of this. I don't think it's necessarily wrong to hate them. I think it's right to hate Nazism and to hate Nazis. I haven't been to the Hermitage, but I should definitely go. That's Jackson's famous plantation in Tennessee. So, give me enough money, and I'll do a live stream from the Hermitage one day. Let me see here. I'm looking through the chat, seeing if there's any questions. So, yeah. What practical work can a historian do? Well, this. And if you're good enough at it, like I hope to be one day, you can make an entire living based off of it. How did Jackson die? I think he died of pneumonia. He was about 78. Every historic event I don't like is a genocide. Yes, every bad thing that's happened in history is a genocide because genocide means nothing anymore. It just means basically, oh, a few people died here, that's a genocide. This is a genocide. This is a genocide. No, there are terms that we can use that are really bad that don't have to be genocide. We're basically devaluing the term genocide, and I really don't like that. It baffles me that the Turkish government and a lot of Turkish people still say that it never happened. It's the only major genocide of the 20th century that is denied by the government that perpetuated it. The Russians do not lie about the Holodomor. The Germans do not lie about the Holocaust. Even the Cambodians do not lie about the Khmer Rouge and the killing fields. So yeah. I heard Andrew Jackson regretted it on his last day on Earth. I don't know what you mean by that. That he regretted removing the Indians? Well, I hope he did. It's nice to see somebody come around to the correct perspective that you can't just throw people out of lands that they lived in for a long time because you hate them. I recently learned of Hugo Brock, who was a German Luftwaffe ace, and I feel a hatred towards him, but my friend says it's wrong to hate him. I mean, I generally am anti-hate, but I think hating is wrong, but I can understand why people would hate Nazis, and I can understand why people would hate the people who fought for Nazis and helped Nazis. What do you think of Julius Caesar governing policy? Caesar was a good leader. There's no doubt about it. Caesar was also way too arrogant to stay in power. What Augustus learned that Caesar did not learn was the ability to basically manipulate the political frame where he could play off his ambitions, arrogance, and pride by basically being appearing to be a humble servant and refusing gifts of power. I have read your comments. I don't really care about your politics right now, Faraz. You can say whatever you want. I'm not going to necessarily interact with it. Troy is real. Schleierman, I think, was the guy who proved that it was real in the late 19th century. What happened to the Native Americans in the United States was systematic ethnic cleansing. By the definition, the argument could definitely be made for genocide. No, it can't. It can, but it's incorrect. You have conquest. I would say you do have ethnic cleansing in many different examples. But you also have a case-by-case basis that's very, very different than other genocides where you have collecting all groups, all types of people. The problem with the genocide, even the ethnic cleansing argument about the Native Americans, is that the Native Americans are not homogeneous. They are extremely diverse. And so there are different things that happen to the First Nations and the Native Americans throughout Canada and the United States and Central and South America that is very different in different contexts. Conquest, warfare, exposure to disease, all of these things. Exposure to disease, usually unintentionally, is the major cause for the depopulation of Native Americans, to the point where they were not strong enough to hold on to their land anymore, and whites took advantage of that. I'm not saying that it's good what happened to the Native Americans. I think it's despicable. But I'm saying that, A, warfare is despicable, and warfare is responsible for the loss of Native American land, the majority of it. B, that doesn't. You can say that it's awful, and it is, without necessarily saying that it's a genocide. Was your father there when you were growing up? Did you spend a lot of time with your father? Sure, why not? Is Billie Eilish going to self-deport? No. Nor is she going to give up that large mansion she owns on ancient Tongva land that belonged to the Tongva Indians. If you believe it's stolen land, give it back, Billie. I just found her comments so stupid. And it's not because of any political position. She's allowed to believe whatever she wants about illegal immigration, but all land is stolen land. I'm sorry, historian here, all land is stolen land, including Native American land that was stolen from other Native Americans long before they ever saw a white person. Yeah. Well, Caesar was a populari. In many ways, Caesar was like Andrew Jackson, a brutish general who knew how to appeal to the masses and help the people. So, of course, he's going to oppose optimates and help them out with political reforms, land reforms, that they desperately needed, and the senators weren't willing to give them. Caesar was an effective leader. There's no doubt about it. Yeah, that's what genocide means. Hatred is the appropriate response to injustice. You can turn the other cheek, just don't turn the other way. Hatred is the appropriate response to injustice. Hatred of it's very easy to hate people who have treated you unjustly, but it is also better to hate the ideas that create it. History is about ideas. Ouch. I'm sorry, David. Sorry you had to go through that. Favorite obscure historical nation. Interesting. Obscure historical nation. Rhodesia is definitely up there because everybody in the channel loves Rhodesia for some reason. They want to bring back Rhodesia. Favorite obscure historical nation. I mean, Carthage is obscure in some ways, but they were almost like an empire. The Phoenicians, the Sea Peoples come to my mind because I think obscure and I'm thinking ancient because a lot of even obscure nations in the modern sense. New Caledonia, the Scottish colony in Panama, interests me a lot. How do we know it is the year 2026? We don't. We're going off of the church. And even if you use CE and BCE, you are still going off of the church. Soon as you do self-deport, you fake Marine. I'm okay. Wow, that's kind of mean. So if we promote same-sex marriage or feminism, which causes low birth rates and abortion, so there is less of a certain race, isn't that a genocide? No, not necessarily. There's no ostensible reason to promote those necessary things. I mean, the Nazis performed sterilizations, but so did the U.S. government at the time, by the way. Look at the Tuskegee experiment, for instance, where they basically gave black men syphilis in order to see its effects on them. There was plenty of efforts at sterilization and I would call it eugenics, maybe even a form of, which can be a form of ethnic cleansing. The progressive movement, social Darwinists believed in eugenics in the turn of the 19th century, but basically believing that some races were physically inferior because their civilizations that they had bred were inferior, so that you should breed the good civilization and not breed the bad civilization. This justified horrific actions of imperialism, oppression, and racism in Africa against African Americans in the United States and against Native Americans as well. So I don't know if that's necessarily happening where we are getting targeted. For instance, so you want to talk about a white genocide is your big thing. That's happening to white people. Abortion disproportionately affects black people in the United States, for instance. It does not. So how is that white genocide if it's disproportionately affecting African Americans? I don't think there is a white genocide. I think there is, I don't necessarily, so if you want to consider abortion a way to limit the population, then it's a black genocide going on by your logic. Please, the Native Americans were killing each other, enslaving each other, and taking land from each other. Indeed, the Cherokee took many of their slaves with them. Most of the Native Americans who fought in the Civil War fought for the Confederates. If you go down the rabbit hole, Billie Eilish really does look like that missing girl from a long time ago. Oh, for goodness sakes, Johnny. We were just the strongest tribe. In a way, that actually is the case. The settlers turned out to be the strongest tribe. And and biologically, they were able to outlast the other tribes. It's not good. It's not good that people get mass diseases they can't resist and die from it because somebody shows up and thinks that this is theirs now. I'm not justifying any of it. I'm saying it is far more complex than simple genocide. No, I think Jackson is, you didn't see what I was explaining. You really did not listen to how I was comparing Jackson and Caesar. Happy Sunday, Daniel. Great to see you. Billie just needs to go where she can marry her brother. I don't think she wants to marry. What's the brother's name? Liam or something? Look, I really like her music. She's a talented individual, but she doesn't understand history. It's obvious. I mean, there's a lot of people on the right who don't understand history when they talk about immigration. These people who talk about, we need to bring back quota systems, for instance. Quota systems were inherently racist and meant to be racist. They meant to exclude particularly Asians and Hispanics from coming to the United States. People on the right wing don't know that because they listen to Tucker Carlson. Although, again, a lot of people, and it's not just overwhelming loads of people, it's just some people who advocate these ideas don't know the historical basis of these ideas and how bad they are. Call it what you want. The British, U.S., and France ended slavery in that order. Greatest country in the world. I thought France ended it before, Hans. I thought France ended it before the Americans did. But yes, the West did end slavery despite being the main progenitors of intercontinental slave trade of millions of people. Yes, it's Andrew Jackson behind me. We just did our live stream lecture on the 7th President of the United States, USOA. I think while you are claiming to be post-woke person, you are influenced by woke media, and that causes subconsciously have prejudice towards white people and support white genocide without realizing it. Funny little theory. I'm not supporting white genocide because look at me. I'm not supporting any genocide because I have a brain. Or I have a heart. Natives technically were trying to do genocide and ethnic cleansing. They wanted all the whites dead. They were absolutely terrible people. Well, not all the natives were like this, just like not all the white settlers wanted to erase them. But Jackson himself saw natives destroy his life in North Carolina. So I can understand why Jackson had some of the views he did. It's hard when natives come and take and steal women, abuse them, and kill men, and burn forts and settlements to have anything but an absolute view of them as savages. But then you realize that the reason they did, but you don't realize, you're not self-aware enough to see that the reason they did that was because you took that land, killed a bunch of them, and a bunch of them died from disease, so now they feel threatened by you. This is not a photo of Lincoln. Did you know he battled in a gun duel? He battled in a lot of gun duels. There are 3 countries in Cyprus. That's true. Great Britain's there. The British owned Cyprus for a long time. Why did the island nation of Cyprus split into 2 nations? Well, you've got the Turks in the east and the Greeks taking it back in the west after the fall of the Ottomans. I'd like to be king of Andorra. There's an ancient land that's been lost. The Holy Roman Empire, maybe well, that's not obscure, but that's not a modern nation. That's one that just doesn't exist. And yes, I do understand imperial powers. They're not pleasant to hear. Does cheating make you intelligent? Does cheating make you intelligent? A good question. I wonder what Andrew Jackson would say to that. I think he would say that cheating proves some form of intelligence. Yeah, sterilizing people with Down syndrome, sterilizing people of different races. This was all very common in the early 20th century by the progressive movement. Despite their advancements in fighting for workers' rights, democratic activities such as the direct election of senators and the 16th Amendment, and all the other things they did that actually helped the country a great deal, progressives really did a number in promoting eugenics, sterilization, in even forms of what we would call today Christian nationalism. Even Woodrow Wilson seemed to be open to some of that. You didn't stumble into an echo chamber, because we are not an echo chamber. Yes, abortion affects black people, but since all immigrants are not white and balances the lower birth rates of people of color, you see replacement of white people with people of color. Well, again, that's such a historically ignorant position to take. I can understand why it's a politically savvy position to take, but historically speaking, you have immigrants from the Irish weren't considered white. Let me see here. Finally, now it's working, sorry. But, you know, the Polish and the Irish, these were people we would consider to be white today, who were coming in and taking and ruining America because they were messing up what America was supposed to be. There was anti-Catholic sentiment, anti-Jewish sentiment. People who are considered white weren't considered white for a long time, except Hispanics, who were considered white until they weren't considered white, and then were considered to be a plague upon white people and traditional American values. So we can talk about, traditional America is a white nation and stuff, but which white people is it? Because there's white people who weren't considered white people and were heavily persecuted because they were considered to be different and considered to be polluting America with very different values and ideas. So, why did they call Andrew Jackson Old Hickory? His soldiers believed he was tough as the wood itself. And yes, this is my Hugh Hefner smoking jacket, but it turns me into History Hefner. Respect from London. Well, thank you, Samuel. It's great to have you here. Russia ended slavery first. Russia ended serfdom right before the Americans ended slavery. That's how far behind the Russians were. You unbiased historian or Eurocentric historian or omniscient? I try to be all 3. But I'm not Eurocentric. I try not to be Eurocentric. I try to talk about history from all different perspectives as much as I can. Shouldn't we care more about how we know what we do rather than what we do know about history just because the book says something doesn't make it true? That's true. That's why corroborating sources, looking into primary sources, archaeology, studying history from below, all sorts of different people is extremely important. And yes, Jackson did found the Democratic Party, although Van Buren was the one who created the political machine. Go watch my video on the creation of the political parties. I talk a lot about this. Let me see here. Slave riots, revolts ended slavery, not Western civility. No, slave riots brought attention, like Nat Turner's revolt brought attention to the religious movement called the Second Great Awakening, which happens under Jackson's watch in the early 1830s, which basically starts off people like Frederick Douglass. Well, he wasn't really the big fixture then, but what's his name? William Lloyd Garrison, the Liberator, so slave revolts bring attention to the issue, but slave revolts never were successful in ending slavery. When will you do Tartaria history? I don't know enough about it. I think it's overblown anyways. People are talking about how America is going to fall once this white population goes to minority in a nation built by their people. I mean, I don't know. We don't normally see this in history. It'll be a new. The Romans are probably the closest comparison where foreign birth rates did change the entire outlook of Rome, but the Romans invited them in, basically because of low birth rates of their own population. But the Roman Empire was already well into decline by that period. So who knows? We haven't really seen in history a native population get outbirthed by people who are traditionally non-native to that area. They become the new natives, and then the original race or ethnicity that was the majority is now the minority. And that obviously comes with huge cultural changes. I don't know. We'll see, Rooster. White people are more likely to hate white people and be for white genocide. I also think that happens subconsciously. People support white genocide without knowing. Self-hatred among races is common across the board. It's not just white people. I actually wonder if half the people in history ever even existed or if they were just written in to make them seem a little special. Based on different people, based on different time periods, maybe King Arthur is an amalgamation of different kings, most likely, who lived in Celtic and Anglo-Saxon England. Did the Romans miss America? Yes. Don't forget the millions of Italians and Scots that were taken to North Africa after they were castrated and marched across the desert somewhere around 1700. Yes, that's true. You're descended from castrated people. That probably isn't true, but it is true that many white people were enslaved by Africans, by Muslims and things like that. Well, even if Tartaria is real, that doesn't mean history is fake. And thank you, Tanya, for sending the membership. So Toto, you now have the ability to get early access. You have members only live. We do one of those once a month, and you also have bonus content that you can't get by just being a subscriber. Yes, Wilson was a massive supporter of eugenics. What I am saying is the world has a way of pushing evil people with evil people. White and black American people will soon face a similar problem. They will be conquered by settlers, borders, anyone. Okay, then. I don't know if that's true. Why some northeastern Tunisians look white. Intermarriage, you also have a completely different cultural, ethnic, and racial makeup of North Africa than sub-Saharan Africa. Cleopatra was obviously associated with the Greeks. The Romans and the Greeks conquered those lands, so you have some intermixing between Southern Europeans, and this is why they're their own group of people called the Mediterraneans, and a Tunisian is as much a Mediterranean as a Spaniard is. I'm so sick of politics. I will take a month away from it. I just want to sleep and wake up in 2028 when the real fun begins. Yeah. Well, if you're sick of the politics, come here. We talk about it only in the context of history. Why some people in North Africa and Lebanon look white. Again, I already answered that. Cheating can never be intelligent because it is mandatorily tied to a period of time that isn't effective. Then it dies, and thus not intelligence. Intelligence is permanent learning. Can you permanently learn how to cheat in different ways? I'm not saying cheating is good. I'm saying it requires learning and some form of intelligence. Do you consider Jews as white or Semitics or mixed? Jackson is one of my favorite presidents. He's not one of mine, but I have talked about how impactful he is. So if you listen to the earlier part of the live stream and last week's, you'll find out what a complex, interesting, impactful, yet morally flawed man Jackson is. Has anyone ever told you that you look like Draymond Green? Lots of people, all the time. Let me see here. Well, modern definition of white is people whose roots can be traced back to Europe. Caucasians, yeah. Now, U.S. is becoming a nation of people whose roots are in Asia and Africa and South America. The United States probably, I can understand why people in England and France are so weirded out by that. The United States probably has the least ability to challenge that because despite the fact that the United States was overwhelmingly founded by white people with African slaves, you also have a long tradition of immigration which has opened the floodgates over and over again, if you want to use that language, to people who are non-Angloid, first of all, so whites who are not Angloid, then Jews as well as Gentiles, Catholics as well as Protestants, and then, yes, Hispanics and Asians and people from the Middle East. So they're just the latest rung on the ladder of many runs on a long ladder of immigrant groups who have come into the United States and supposedly are changing the culture. They contribute to it and they assimilate. Now, how well that's going to happen with people who are culturally much different than Europeans were to Americans in the 19th century is just one of those little kinks that makes history not repeat, but rhyme a lot. There's always different alterations and changes and subtle alterations and iterations. George Washington was the only president to be under the Democratic Republican Party. No, he was the only president to not have a party. Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe were all Democratic Republicans. During the Trail of Tears, many of the Native Americans owned slaves and took them along with them. Yep, talked about that earlier. He's the reason white non-property owners could vote. That's true. Jackson enfranchised non-property owners, white males, to vote. Okay, go ahead and buy silver. Good to see you, Don. What's your favorite alternate history idea? What if Napoleon? What if it's? I've had many ones. It's mainly if Napoleon wins in Russia, but now I'm actually of the mind of what if a Kaiser won? What if the Germans won the Great War or World War I or what I call World War II? Because it just comes with so many mind-boggling changes. Especially if they won early enough, you don't have a Russian Revolution. You don't have the Ottomans being destroyed. You don't have the Mandate of Palestine. There's so many things. I think it's good that the Allies won that war. I think the Kaiser was in the wrong. But there's so many things from that war that if the Allies hadn't won, that actually might be better because you don't have the Nazis. You don't have the League of Nations and its ineffectiveness. What it would have looked like instead. You have Austria-Hungary surviving. You have all these empires that are surviving that might have been better. Those areas of the world might have been better off if those empires had survived, because look at what the Bolsheviks did. Look at the chaos in the Middle East. Look at the Nazis. It's pretty interesting. But good question, Tan. Jackson should stay on 20? I don't know. I kind of think not. Self-hatred of one's tribe is called oikophobia when we are living through a pandemic of it. Interesting. Well, at least I have a name for it, and I can sound smart like that. Oikophobia. Yeah, Jackson fought the law, and Jackson won. Native American tribes in the South had black slaves. Yes, many of them did. And were enslaving other natives before the blacks showed up. Jackson adopted an Indian? Oh, yeah, I've heard that story before. Yeah, was it a boy? He actually raised him, and he became a successful businessman. Yeah, it's weird that Jackson looks a little like Epstein. I think it's just total coincidence. Yeah, they couldn't take the bullet out because it would have killed him, and he loved to duel. Let me see. You know some Sanskrit? I mean, I don't know Sanskrit, but I know about it. I'm of Japanese descent, and I look white. Interesting. Okay. What you did understand what I said. Read too fast, learning, not learning, didn't. You didn't understand. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, it's hard to understand somebody who's screaming by using cap locks, which is what cap locks is, and is clearly deranged. Isn't signing the Indian Act different than Trump putting on executive orders? Why was I banned? You weren't banned. No one was banning you. But the Indian Act is different than Trump and executive orders. But you do have things that courts can review and say are non-constitutional. Politics is just embedded with some culture now. It used to be more separated. That's true. Can you explain if Middle Eastern people are white or not? It seems anywhere out of USA classifies Middle Eastern people as their own race. Yeah, it's an overwhelming generalization because of Indo-Aryan and the migration, Turkic peoples who settled in different areas of the world like South Asia and the Middle East and even Europe, that they would all be the same, but they are clearly not. They are culturally so different, and they're on different continents. Yes, silver isn't a lot. Cheating, no matter how much intelligence requires, is short-lived by nature, so it is not intelligent. It is not. Cheaters never prosper, is what you're saying, and you're kind of right. Who's your favorite president? Lincoln. Washington hated political parties. Yes, I'm not saying immigration is bad, but systematically trying to replace white people just because of the skin color is bad. When this is proven to me, then I will believe it. What are your thoughts on the Mandela effect? I don't know. Was it Paris that was in my profile picture, or was it the Arc de Triomphe before I changed my profile picture? Mandela effect. What if Belgium allowed Germany to send its troops through? Britain doesn't get involved in the war. The war's probably over a lot more quickly. I mean, the 1952 census, Caucasian was 97%. Ellis Island was open for 100 years and only brought in 11 million. Biden did 20 million in 4 years. It's weaponized at this point. That's all political talking points. The country is far more prosperous, far more spread out, and far more developed, and so proportionally, you have 11 million people brought in over 60 years versus what people claim and cannot prove is 20 million over 4 years. It's like when people say, well, if a million people die today, that's awful. If 1 million people die in 1800, that's catastrophically awful because it's far more. The numbers are the proportion. It's people live longer, infant mortality rates are down, all of that stuff. So I don't know. I think you got to be proportional with some of this stuff. What if George Washington was killed during the Revolutionary War? I don't think America becomes a country. I just don't think it holds together. I don't think the Continental Army holds together. I think the British probably win the war, and even if they don't, who's going to lead America? The Germans did win the war. There was Antarctica and Argentina and South America. We're still dealing with it today, and technically the Russians won the war because they took half of Europe. Okay, then. Tell me why no European comes to America. Why media portrays whites as racist and historical oppressors, so we have prejudice against them. Why is their birth rate on decline? Success, social, economic, and technological success usually means lower birth rates. It's not necessarily people not planning for that. Technology means people have more, and prosperity means people have more leisure time, and they actually stop having children as much. It's actually proven. It's overwhelmingly proven. That's why India's population growth is coming to a standstill. It's why Nigeria's is growing is growing wild. But it's not necessarily targeted. And just saying white people have done bad things in the past isn't the same as saying white people shouldn't have more children. These things are all explainable. And a lot of Europeans do come to the Americas. It's just you see far more people coming in through Latin America because they're closer to Latin America and from China than from Europe. Let me see here. Great Replacement is real. Look at Canada with Indians, Muslims. America is the same. Around, look at Europe right now. I mean, yes, people are being replaced because you have immigration and low birth rates, but is it an intentional theory? Is what I'm saying. Is that an intentional thing, or is that just ipso facto? You have low birth rates on one end caused by economic prosperity, access to birth control, and technologically advanced society, compared with large migration movements, which are caused partially by the destabilization of areas by the United States and the Europeans during the War on Terror, for instance. Slave revolts brought the attention, but also fear, which is the inception of the end of slavery. No, it's not. No, it isn't. It really, really isn't. Jefferson Davis wasn't afraid of slaves. I'm sorry. History repeats itself. Can't print billions of fiat currency, and clearly U.S. government doing fraud, and it's not the effect. Okay, then. Yeah, fiat currency is a weak stance, probably. Will the Epstein files alter the course of U.S. history? Yes, it already has, in some ways. Let me see. How historically accurate to say that Russia won World War II or World War III? It's very historically accurate. They did win it. But the Americans also won it. They were fighting with each other, not against each other. And acronodropsolaphobia is the phobia of dwarfs, in case you wanted to know. I did not. Are you familiar with a mod for a game called Kaiserreich? What if Germans won? No, I've not, but it sounds cool. Imagine if President Jackson had been the first emperor. He was open to it at certain times. Yeah, I've heard of Hearts of Iron. Are you ecophobic? Does that make you think of genocide of Native Americans as bad, but genocide of white people is okay? I don't think the Native Americans were genocided, and I don't think white people are being genocided. There's a whole series of books by Harry Turtledove that build on the promise that Stonewall Jackson survived the Civil War. Yeah, I like Harry Turtledove. I am a brown person with heart, and that's why I express solidarity with white people. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate solidarity with white people and black people and all sorts of people. Anyone who wants to learn about history of any background can come here. And we have open borders here at the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel because it's the internet and you can come on here as long as you don't become an absolute, waste of time. Andrew Jackson relying on ignorance, technology, and viruses is based on cheating in that order, except that it's not. I don't think you actually know how history works, but okay. You're related to both of them. Interesting. 2 cents on when Hitler actually died. USA spent millions looking for a live Hitler in the 50s and 60s. Okay, believe whatever you want to believe. That doesn't mean it's not a wacky conspiracy. Never seen this channel, but I like how you're doing this. The channel does say friendly history, not debate politics and ethics aggressively. Yeah, I mean, I try to be friendly. I try to be neighborly. I can get mad. I've gotten mad many times. I'm trying to talk about history mainly, so. When's our country going to finally honor due process again? When's our country? I don't know. It's not my job to figure that out. And to say the Americans have always honored due process is ridiculous. What percentage of people living in the USA would voted for Jackson for president each time? The first time, I think, he runs 3 times. He loses the first time, but he gets a plurality, about 45%. He wins the second time, getting well over into the late 50s, early 60s, and the third time. in 1832. He wins by an even larger percentage. There's a whole series of books on what happens if George Washington was killed. Yep, thank you, Joseph. Even if his theory was flawed and they don't have this goal of replacing whites, their actions shows otherwise. Mass immigration, forced multiculturalism, all of this for more vote down the line. I'm not saying that it's necessarily a good thing to have mass migration, multiculturalism, and these things. I haven't made a political statement. I'm just saying that that isn't necessarily, even if it's not a good thing, that's not necessarily an intentional thing caused by global elites to genocide white people. I think you can make an easier case that there's a genocide in Gaza than you can make that case. Can you compare French Revolution and the printing of paper money to current state situation because of printing billions in fraud? Well, the French had to create their own new economic system and their own paper and their own dollar after the French Revolution started. And so, yeah, printing currency at high rates leads to hyperinflation. And the Germans did it in the Weimar Republic too. The average U.S. state is 6.5 million population. 20 million is 3 U.S. states in 4 years proportionally. And yes, 20 million, 6.5 have south border, 2.5 north border, 4 million visa overstays, 1.2 million TPS, and another 5 million no government checkpoint proportionality. Okay, well, you actually, I would like to know where you got that information from because those are whopper numbers, but you've explained it pretty well with proportionality. I mean proportionality in the sense of 11 million in Ellis Island over 60 years is actually a lot of people compared to today's numbers, considering the total population of the U.S. from 1892 to 1952 when Ellis Island shut down. I call the 7 Years' War, you must be new, Crowbar, I call the 7 Years' War the First World War. Why didn't the Soviet Union accomplish a moon landing? Because they gave up after the U.S. landed on the moon. It just seemed like they didn't want the sloppy seconds. Wasn't it the Soviet Union that won, not Russia? Soviet Union was more modern-day Russia and had various ethnicities. Yeah, but the Soviet Union is Russia. De Gaulle called it Russia. It's run by the Russians. It's run by Russian communists called the Bolsheviks, which become Lenin and Stalin. Yep. I do my best, Zachary. You can have solidarity with white people as much as you want, but there's not a genocide going on. Sorry. It was 22:33 at this point, so when you said 30 minutes over by this point. Well, okay, I really don't care. Let me see here. I'll wrap it up. I'm just trying to catch up with the chat. They are bringing their votes here, so the next generation constantly votes for them. Typical Canadian liberal playbook. That happens a lot. That happened in American politics. Why the Irish were such a bulwark and cornerstone of the Democratic Party and political machine in the late 19th century. Tammany Hall. Who is the greatest American? Probably George Washington. Did you know that famous picture of FDR and Churchill and Stalin sitting together is taken in Tehran, my home city? Yes, I do. What's a plurality? Plurality is less than 50%, but more than anyone else has. So 45 to 30 to 25. 45 would be the plurality. And ours it finally showed up, and yes, we are in the middle of the Q&A. Could World War II be avoided if Treaty of Versailles were less harsh? No, that's a Nazi propaganda lie, by the way. And there's our social medias. Patreon, Substack, Discord. You can talk with us more on Discord. You can read my articles on Substack. There's bonus content on Patreon, and of course there's also TikTok. Do you believe in genocide? I believe it has happened. I don't believe that everything is one. That is history, unless you can prove me wrong. No, fighting wars, yes. Treaties that disenfranchised natives and manipulated them is cheating, yes. And giving people diseases through biological warfare could be considered a form of cheating. That happened once or twice. But the vast majority of Native Americans who died due to disease, and the remainder lost their land in wars and conquest, and some of them lost them in treaties or the buying of land. That's not necessarily cheating. Who's more successful, KGB or CIA? Well, the former KGB agent is in charge of Russia trying to rebuild the Soviet Union, so I would say they actually kind of edge them out. Do you think if we could go back to the Ellis Island system of American immigration, how do we get to this new style of immigration we have today? Quota system basically made Ellis Island unnecessary, and then 13 years later, I forget what it was called, but Lyndon Johnson basically opened the floodgates for American immigration, for better or for worse. I have often said that an Ellis Island system would actually work really well for the United States because you would have quick processing and naturalization of people, or at least green card status, temporary residential status, but you would also have the ability to sift out. So you need to make the legal immigration, you could make the legal immigration system a lot more effective and quick, and you could then have no excuse for anyone overstaying their visas or being in the country illegally. So you could actually have mass deportations, but you could also have a quick way for people to but you won't have an excuse for people to come through over the border illegally or overstay a visa, because the process of naturalization is so much quicker. I mean, nobody's going to do that because it requires logic and common sense, but yeah, the Ellis Island way of doing things was really efficient. 98% acceptance, millions of people, thousands processed in a day. It's the pinnacle of American government efficiency, if you can believe that or not. MASH was about the Korean War and aired in the 70s. Why are there not been a TV series about the Vietnam conflict? Because Vietnam was not a victory. Think that genocide is with social media men? What are you talking about? Someone would do a movie on Baron Roman von... I don't know who that is. Stalin wasn't ethnically Russian. He was German. No, he was Georgian. Saying Russian won World War II plays into Putin's propaganda. No, it doesn't. The Russians, he was the leader of the Russians, the Soviet Union. He was, of course, Georgian, but he was the communist leader of Russia and its satellite states. So, what percentage of people living in the U.S. could and did vote in early 19th century presidential elections? Very, very low. Extremely low. You've got low voter turnout just being a regular problem, but you also have the fact that blacks and women can't vote. Selective genocide means there will be humanity to have a future in the future. Okay, then, I don't know what that is. Thank you for subscribing, Lions. We may disagree, but I appreciate your fervor for history. Thank you, Wells. I appreciate the subscription. And we are now into 11,000 subscribers thanks to you guys. And we will hopefully get to 20,000 by the end of the year. Bringing viruses and knowing that you have viruses is cheating. Making people ignorant over time is cheating. They didn't know how viruses were spread. They really, really didn't. If you didn't mind explaining from what you know, how does the U.S. immigration system work today? It's a much longer process. There's temporary status, there's work visas, there's protected legal status, which is given to refugees and stuff like that, where you can stay in the country because your country is going through problems, and the hope is that you will be able to return, but a lot of people do not. Green cards are permanent residency, where people are allowed to stay in the country, but they are not citizens. The naturalization process can take anywhere from 10 to 20 years. It's supposed to work where you're supposed to be able to enter the country, work, or go to school, or find a life, and then decide if you want to stay. If you want to stay, it should be able for you to become first a permanent resident and then a citizen. But it's not that quick, and it's not that easy. How do you think England would have changed if the Normans never won? Fascinating. I don't think Britain becomes European. I think England becomes its own, remains a different entity completely. If you want to know what makes England European, it's the Norman conquest. Just the facts of how the U.S. immigration... I did give as much as I could. I'm not an expert in it exactly, but violations of that obviously can lead to deportation or to people being basically hiding from immigration and customs enforcement. Thank you for joining us from Tel Aviv, Oscar. Did America almost become a monarchy? Many times. They wanted George Washington to be a king. They wanted Andrew Jackson. They called him a king. I mean, it's happened many times. I do not mean to be antagonistic, but Americans have been conned into believing Russia is a threat. Russia is a paper tiger. It's not a good paper tiger. There's a lot of horrible things the Russians are doing. For all those on the far right who want to talk about Russia being super moral, Russia has more abortions than any other country except China. Proportional to its population, has the lowest church attendance in Europe, and has the largest population of Muslims. So all of those Nick Fuentes sycophants and Tucker Carlson sycophants who think Russia is nice and we should leave Russia alone because they don't want anything but restoring land they used to own need to realize that Russia, by your own moralistic standards, is extremely immoral, even worse than France. So Russia, but I think there's a lot of immorality in Russia. I think there's a lot of corruption in Russia, but I don't think that Putin is actually that big of a threat. I don't think that appeasing him is the same as appeasing Hitler. But I'm not saying that we should appease someone like Putin. Thank you. I really appreciate you watching. We do have a Discord. It's in the chat. Please follow us, Tan. We talk and chat and do all sorts of fun stuff there. Do you see any possibility way communism could have worked in the Soviet Union? Say if you had the Mensheviks instead of the Bolsheviks, or Beria or Trotsky instead of Stalin. No, I think Trotsky would have been worse than Stalin. I don't know about Beria. I think that, and Beria was a horrible human being, by the way. He was the Epstein of the 20th century, by the way, of the middle 20th century. What Beria did to children is absolutely disgusting. I mean, I don't know about the Mensheviks. Richard Pipes has said that they really just all wanted the same thing. So it was kind of death by 1,000 cuts or just a quick, painful death. I don't know. I know the Mensheviks really just kind of got thrown out by Lenin. It would have been interesting had they had their chance. The socialist revolutionaries like Kerensky. I would have loved to see a Russian democratic experiment under Alexander Kerensky. I would have loved to see Peter Stolypin not being killed. Russia could have become democratic. But I don't think the Russians, I think that was their chance. I think they blew their chance. I don't think Russia's ever going to be democratic. Is Nicki Minaj not a citizen? You can't be deported if you have permanent legal residence. And celebrities and performers and entertainers have special types of visas that allow them to stay for a long time. Yes, you missed the last part. Last week was the first half of his life. Why was China allowed to gain so much control of Africa? Spheres of influence, the good faith idea that created by Nixon, where China and the United States work with each other in good faith to bring economic stability to the world, reliance on free trade rights, basically has allowed China to grow its influence in areas of the world like Africa. Putin is saving Russia from the corruption of the West. Well, he's not doing a very good job of it. I will answer to Discord and emails more, but I haven't gotten any emails. But you can email me, friendlyneighborhoodhistory@gmail.com, if you want a one-on-one conversation with me. What are you saying? The left feels sympathetic to Putin, and the right to the left. Right is the party that hates Putin. You got it reversed. No, I actually think that there's a lot of people on the right who hate Putin or have some sort of Cold War motif, but there's a response to neoconservatism on the far right that's isolationist and will basically, in order to prove isolationism is correct, will basically excuse what Putin has done, and will basically say Russia's actually good, and Putin is a master manipulator and has realized that there's this squishiness and takes advantage of it. But basically saying, oh yeah, there's people who on the right that you have to realize we're the Christians and you're the bad ones. Look at your society and look at my society, and they're duped into it. They don't actually read, but they duped to it. All right, talking about my boy Andrew Jackson. I was earlier, Ben, last week and this week. I don't support King Trump. I don't support kings. No King's Day is July 4th, so that was a stupid idea anyways. The Russian tiger has hypersonic nuclear teeth. I mean, so does Pakistan. Is Pakistan a huge international threat? Is Germany? Thank you, Angel. I learned much by people coming here, so thank you so much. Let me see here. And everyone hates me because I'm Israeli, every side. Yes, it must not be easy being an Israeli. But I've had people from Palestine. I've had people who are Israeli. I've had people from the Middle East. I've had people who are Jews, Christians, Muslims, atheists. I believe everybody should have a right to come to the channel and learn about history. And that's what I love about it. What do you think about Greenland in terms of benefits? The U.S. has wanted Greenland for a while. It's just been a dormant thing for the last 75 years, but Truman wanted to buy it because of the Cold War. The U.S. occupied it in the last World War. Pakistan is not an existential threat. Okay, the Americans are not constantly being told about Pakistan's military operations the way they are with the Russians. Russia is still very much a bogeyman to the Americans. But I understand why you could say that radical Islam in Pakistan is threatening. Yes, and people from Pakistan who bring radical Islamic ideology with them to Europe and the United States are definitely can be quite dangerous because of some of their views, to at least Western standards. But yeah, I think Greenland, the whole thing is you've got access to Arctic Sea trade. You have access to it gives you access that Russia has, and I think that's really wherein lies the rub for Pakistan. I mean, for Greenland. You can say that Russia rules Soviet Union, but to say that only Russia won World War II is incorrect because there's far more than Russia who fought the war. Oh yeah, of course. I'm not saying only. The United States and Great Britain and France won the war too, and the Germans, if you consider the West German. Well, no, not the Germans. The Germans lost. And you know who's a big winner of the war that we don't talk about? Francisco Franco, because by the U.S. Because who knows what would have happened with the Nazis. But Franco is not as big of a sycophant of Hitler's as you think, and the U.S. basically liked that he wasn't a communist, so let him stay in power. The Ethiopians won the war. The Israelis won the war, if you really think about it. In the wake of the war, the UN was able to justify the creation of the Israeli state. How do we go from a society that had 61% in 1991 to 70% in 2007 support for the U.S. military with 1.3 million soldiers on the war on terror to nobody liking the military today? The failures of the war on terror. People were ready to go after 9/11, but on both sides of the aisle. But now it's clear that people just look at the American military as either inefficient or violent butchers. Didn't Russia attempt democracy under Yeltsin? Yeah, that was probably the most noble try the Russians have ever had with it. The economy was tanking anyways. Without getting too political, rank Trump out of 10 strictly from a historical. Can't. It's too early to do that, Crowbar. It's just too early. Maybe in 10 years I will. China is probably doing economically trapping Africa, but at least they build infrastructure, don't colonize Africa. Most importantly, didn't condescend Africa. If you don't think that they're colonizing and condescending Africa, you don't know how post-colonial relationships work. You don't know how hegemonic influence works. How it seems cleaner and nicer not to colonize and overtake a government, but it's based. But when you can create some of the same trappings that are just as binding. That's why France continues to extract wealth and power from Africa. Radical Islam comes from the filthy, dirty, destabilized, violent regions of the Islamic world. Immigration from those areas doesn't help them. They need to change their own nations. Well, at the same time, you also have to understand that they're not helping any of the Muslims out either. Let me see. Thanks, Fidel. It's great to have you here. What if Japan was divided like Germany? That would have been interesting, but the U.S. didn't want the Soviets in there. One of the reasons they used the bomb was because of that. Yeah, no, pickle pants. It's Andrew Jackson. Let me see. The Greenland thing is really about us leaving nuclear treaties, but they don't want to talk about that. That's true. That too. What is scientific about social science? You can study how people behave in a particular context and analyze the results and monitor for controls. That's why history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes a lot. Do you think Americans should be proud of their history, or you think they've improved from their faults, or should we hate U.S. history? I think we should do all three. I think we should be ashamed. Americans, as an American, I'm ashamed of some of the things America has done. I love some of the other things America has done, and I think we should learn from it. I think it's all three. It's not 33, 33, 30. It's 100, 100, 100. Be ready to look at all of them, no matter what nation you're in. What I do not like is that this standard of we have to think about everything bad we've done doesn't have anything to do, is not applied to China, is not applied to Vietnam, is not applied to the Russians, is not applied to the Saudis. There's plenty of evidence of bad things that those societies have done throughout history. Americans should be proud of their history, but they need to know that they've improved, and they need to know what's right and what's wrong about their history. So, yeah. Anyways, I'm going to sign off. We went way over. I was expecting to only go about 65, 70 minutes, but we went about half hour over. Thank you for my moderators for staying on. If Andrew Jackson was alive today, what would he say about white genocide? He would say it doesn't exist, because even he wasn't that ignorant. Although he would be absolutely horrified by the decline in white populations. Let me see here. You said once before that the U.S. is the only country that is self-correcting, or even the West. The West is self-correcting. I don't see that in the East, and I wonder why. Do you feel that Israelis could do things differently in Gaza in dealing with the Palestinian conflict? Is peace in the Middle East possible? Yes, it is, and things could be done differently there. I've talked about this issue way too much. In fact, I'm going to have my moderators from now on actually lay out an explanation of what I think about this issue, so that you just don't ask me about it anymore, because I'm tired of talking about it. You won't believe, you're probably well-intentioned. It's a good question you asked, but you won't believe how much people are like, do you want Palestine to be freed, or you want dead Gazan children, or what do you want? And I'm like, nuance, balance. So yeah. Do all conflicts cease when resources are no longer scarce? No. Conflict is part of human nature. Conflict, it's always getting more of those resources. But should they repeat the same things they did back in history? No. When will you become U.S. president? I will not. So shouldn't our negatives in the U.S. be seen as self-correcting, or is it so it is a positive negative? It's learning from your mistakes. But that doesn't mean the mistakes didn't happen, and that doesn't mean the mistakes were good. It takes a really honest person to admit that though this is a great country, we can make it better. Yes. And it takes a really honest person to realize that America has always had great things about it and always had bad things about it, and you don't have to live one way or the other. You can accept all of it. Yeah. So anyways, I'm going to sign off. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you all have a really, really good Super Bowl. So called Filthy Islam taught the West how to use soap, enlightenment to math and science. It's funny how people think Islam didn't bring anything to the table. Islam brought a lot to the table, but no, just no. What did Obama mean when he said he was going to radically change America? I don't know anymore. Go and enjoy the Super Bowl. Take care. Have a great week, and I'll see you back here 6 p.m. Eastern for history and social studies for questions. That'll be Friday and next Saturday. We've got a lot coming up because that's our birthday week. It's our second birthday. We're entering our third year. Take care, like and subscribe, and I will see you later. As always,